Ever get that feeling that the world's just, well, a bit too chaotic? Like there's all this randomness pushing things around. But what if maybe that feeling is actually part of something bigger?
Like a pattern hidden underneath.
Exactly. What if there's a kind of hidden logic, maybe a grand design that's subtly influencing the events we see flashing across our screens?
That's pretty much the core question we're tackling today. We're doing a deep dive into this collection of essays. It's called Stones on the Chessboard Expanded Chapter Essays.
Right.
And it's interesting because it's not just one author's viewpoint. It pulls together quite a range of information to build its case.
Yeah, and our mission really, for you listening, is to unpack the main arguments in this book. We want to explore this idea that maybe global events aren't quite as random as they seem, that they could potentially be orchestrated.
Now, I can imagine some skepticism there. Orchestrated, it sounds.
A bit much. Yeah, and that's totally understandable.
But the interesting thing about this book is how it tries to ground these ideas. It points to things like leaked documents, whistleblower accounts, even historical records.
So the idea is, let's just park the skepticism for a moment and really dig into what this chessboard, as they call it, might look like. Okay, so chapter 1, it jumps right in with this concept, the engineered crisis.
Yeah, and the premise here is pretty stark. It suggests that crises aren't always just bad luck. Sometimes they might be deliberately created or maybe just strategically used to centralize control. And the book gives some historical examples to try and illustrate this.
Right, like the sinking of the RMS Lusitania,
Yeah.
1915. Most of us just know it as this terrible event in World War I.
But the book offers a different angle. It argues it was used partly, at least, as a catalyst, something to shift public opinion, and help draw the U.S. into the war, which in turn expanded the influence of certain groups.
Okay.
And then fast forward almost a century to the 2008 banking collapse. The book makes a similar kind of argument.
Not saying it was all planned, but...
Exactly. Not necessarily that every mistake was deliberate, but that the chaos that followed, it created a huge opportunity for consolidation in the financial world. Power ended up in fewer hands, often, at the expense of ordinary people. The book tries to connect these dots, these events, to an expansion of influence for, certain groups.
So engineered crises create these moments for centralization. Then chapter 2 brings in this really vivid analogy, the masters and the pawns.
Yeah, it paints this picture of a global stage. You've got these hidden masters pulling strings, and then the pawns, who aren't just politicians, by the way.
No.
No, it could be people in all sorts of positions, often unaware they're even being directed.
Okay, so how does this supposedly happen today?
Well, the book gives examples. Like, think about the Brexit referendum. It looks at how social media sentiment was allegedly manipulated through very targeted campaigns, potentially swaying the vote.
Wow. And it's not just these huge geopolitical shifts either, right?
No, they also look at things like political financing in the U.S., the sort of hidden money flowing into political action committees. The suggestion is that this is another way these unseen players might be influencing democratic outcomes.
But it also gets personal, doesn't it? I remember reading about individual stories in this chapter.
Absolutely. And those really make it hit home. They talk about a journalist, say, who felt pressured to drop a story, or a scientist whose funding dried up after they challenged a dominant narrative.
Right.
These stories kind of illustrate the potential human cost if these alleged power dynamics are real.
Okay, so if there are masters, who does the book suggest they might be? Chapter 3 goes into some, let's say, shadowy areas. The silent architects.
Yeah, this is where it looks at networks like the Freemasons, maybe certain secretive European lodges, the Illuminati names that definitely carry a lot of baggage, and even the Bohemian Club.
Stuff you hear about in fiction, almost.
Right. And popular culture often sensationalizes these groups. But what the book tries to explore is how influence might actually be traded and nurtured within these networks. It suggests it goes beyond just social gatherings.
How so?
Well, they point to things like Masonic symbols on early American currency, subtle hints maybe of a deeper influence. And then you have the gatherings at Bohemian Grove in California. It's documented that world leaders and powerful figures meet there privately. The book speculates that these meetings, perhaps even involving rituals, could be places where influence is exchanged and agendas are aligned.
Okay, so if these architects exist, how do they actually, do things? How does influence become action? Chapter 4 suggests one method, wars as calculated moves.
This chapter really shifts the perspective on conflict. Instead of seeing wars just as, say, failures of diplomacy or ideological clashes.
Which is how we normally think of them.
Right. The book argues they can sometimes be deliberate actions, Moves on this global chessboard, often driven by profit or the desire for control.
That's a heavy idea. What examples do they use?
Well, historically, they look at things like the Zimmermann telegram in World War I, presenting it not just as a diplomatic mistake, but possibly part of a calculated play with specific goals.
Okay.
And the first Gulf War is analyzed through this lens of oil for access deals, suggesting powerful economic motives were running underneath the stated reasons.
And it brings it up to the present day, too.
It does. It looks at more recent conflicts, things like the proxy battles playing out in Yemen or the sophisticated disinformation campaigns used around the annexation of Crimea, framing them as modern examples of these kinds of calculated moves. It definitely makes you question the official narrative sometimes.
It really does. So if war is one tool, Chapter
Yeah.
5 talks about something maybe less visible but just as powerful, economic control.
Yes, and this is often seen as a more pervasive weapon because it's less obvious than, say, military action.
This chapter felt very real. They start with the 2008 mortgage crisis, that image of a school teacher in Detroit losing her home.
Contrasted with the bank CEOs who played a part in the crisis getting huge bonuses.
Yeah. It's a powerful contrast, highlighting who wins and who loses in these scenarios.
And importantly, the book doesn't just focus on the U.S., it brings in international examples. Argentina's debt crisis back in the early 2000s.
Greece's austerity measures after 2010.
Right, and the hyperinflation crisis in Venezuela. The book uses these cases, sometimes drawing on accounts from people like former IMF economists or central bank whistleblowers, to suggest a pattern where economic policies might be used strategically to exert control over entire nations.
Controlling the money is controlling the power, essentially. But then Chapter 6 goes even deeper into the battle for the mind, how media shapes what we think.
Yeah, this traces the evolution of shaping narratives, from the old days of, like, yellow journalism
Sensational headlines.
to today's incredibly complex algorithms that basically curate our reality online. The argument is that controlling the story, controlling the narrative, is absolutely fundamental to maintaining any kind of grand design.
They even had that account from inside a social media company, didn't they?
Yes, a whistleblower talking about how the metrics, the way engagement is measured, often ends up prioritizing content that sparks outrage or division. Whether that's intentional or just a side effect, the result can be a more polarized public.
And the case studies are quite chilling, like how information, or maybe misinformation, spread during the Oklahoma City bombing back in '95.
Or the rise of deepfake videos being used in elections now. It really highlights how vulnerable our perception of reality can be.
Okay, so influencing minds, influencing economies. Chapter 7 talks about influencing who's actually in charge, regime change as operation.
Exactly. The idea here is that the rise and fall of governments isn't always just, the will of the people or internal politics. Sometimes, it suggests, it's driven by deliberate external intervention.
And they list some pretty major historical moments.
They do. The overthrow of the Republic of Hawaii, for example, the 1973 coup in Chile, Operation Ajax, which overthrew the government in Iran in 1953.
Events that shape the world we live in.
Absolutely. The book presents these not as spontaneous uprisings, but as operations potentially orchestrated by outside powers. It even discusses things like covert funding for different factions in places like Angola, suggesting external agendas were shaping the nation's future.
It paints a picture of nations being pushed in certain directions. And furthering that theme of hidden hands, Chapter 8 gets into the web of deception, specifically false flag operations.
Right. These are events deliberately designed to look like they were carried out by someone else, usually to blame an enemy or justify some kind of action.
The classic example being the Reichstag fire in 1933 in Germany.
Exactly. And the book draws parallels, perhaps controversially, to more recent events like the allegations around the Skripal poisoning in the UK.
And the argument is?
The argument presented in the book is that these kinds of events, whether historical or contemporary, are tactics used to manipulate public fear and create pretexts for specific strategic goals. Again, it's crucial to state the book is presenting these as interpretations and allegations.
Understood. But it's not all doom and gloom, is it? Chapter 9 offered something different, moments of resistance.
Yes, thankfully. This chapter focuses on instances where people have pushed back against these alleged manipulations. It does offer a sense of agency.
What kind of examples did they give?
Things like activists successfully exposing large-scale financial fraud, like Ponzi schemes, grassroots efforts to challenge or dismantle surveillance systems, the role of open-source platforms in providing alternatives.
WikiLeaks came up, didn't it? And the Arab Spring.
Yes, those are mentioned as examples of information challenging established power structures. Also, the potential of blockchain technology for decentralization, and even things like community banking initiatives, like some in Kenya, showing alternative models.
So it emphasizes that individuals and groups can make a difference, that action is possible.
Definitely. It highlights that awareness and collective action are seen as key counters to these forces.
Okay, so after exploring all these mechanisms, crises, economics, media, regime change, where does the book suggest it's all heading? Chapter
Yeah.
10 is the end game.
This chapter is definitely more speculative. It steps back and asks, okay, if there is this orchestration, what's the ultimate goal? What does the future look like according to this perspective?
And what kind of possibilities does it explore?
It touches on a few potential scenarios, things like the rise of some form of global governance, or maybe a shift towards what it calls neo-feudal economic systems, extreme inequality, essentially.
Or even the opposite,
Or potentially the eventual collapse of centralized power structures altogether. But the book deliberately leaves you with this big unanswered question.
which is,
Who ultimately is supposed to be in control? Who holds the reins in this vast, complex, global chess game? It leaves that question hanging.
yeah, it's a pretty unsettling place to end. So let's try to wrap this up. Our deep dive into stones on the chessboard basically lays out this core argument. Global events might not be as random as they seem.
Right. The book suggests there could be unseen actors, these masters, strategically influencing things to gain or maintain control.
And it builds this case by looking at a huge range of things, reinterpreting historical events, talking about alleged secret society influence, economic manipulation, media control, even orchestrating regime change.
It's a really wide-ranging synthesis of ideas and alleged evidence.
Now, we have to stress again, the book offers a specific and, yes, often controversial viewpoint.
Absolutely. It's presenting one interpretation of history and current events. But by digging into all these different areas and citing various sources, it certainly pushes you, the listener, to think critically, to maybe look for patterns you hadn't considered before.
Definitely. It encourages questioning the surface narrative. And maybe on that note, the final thought for you listening is this. Thinking about the patterns and possibilities discussed today, are there any specific global events, past or present, that you might now see through a slightly different lens?
It's certainly food for thought, and probably encourages doing more of your own reading and critical thinking about the forces that are truly shaping our world.